Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you for inviting me to speak. So I've come to talk to you today to decode some of the discourse in Hebrew. The discourse on parchment, the discourse in newsprint, and the discourse on the internet, of course. Now, you may have an image of Israel. You may like what you see, but it behooves you to also know what's going on behind the scenes, how that image is manufactured, what's really happening on the streets. So, in Israel, the impression you may get is that everything is grand and groovy and golden, but all is not what it seems. You may be surprised to learn that, in fact, Israel has the highest poverty rate of all OECD countries. So what I mean by poverty rate, the disparity between the richest Israelis, like Netanyahu and his associates, the disparity between the richest Israelis and the poorest Israelis is larger than the disparity between rich and poor in any of the other OECD countries. In fact, the poverty rate in Israel is twice the average OECD poverty rate. And it's not only across the board, it's also the most vulnerable communities. So Israel also, if you can imagine this, has the highest child poverty rate in the OECD. It also has the highest elderly poverty rate. So there's some serious problems in Israeli society that you may not have heard about. And it's very troubling, as someone who lives there, to see our elders begging, going through the trash just to find scraps. I see this in my own hometown. And maybe even sadder than this, to our great shame, we see that in recent years, Holocaust survivors of the Nazi Holocaust who live in Israel, are protesting in the streets because their pensions are so miserably low and they have to go through such rigmarole, so much government bureaucracy just to get them. In fact, over 1/3 of Holocaust survivors in Israel live below the poverty line. Now, no one, in my mind, no one should have to make that calculation. Should I pay for, my medicines this month? Or should I pay my heating bill? Or should I pay the rent? No one should have to calculate that in their minds, but certainly not the people who suffered so much. And now, in the twilight of their lives, they have to make this calculation. Another example of a community that's at great risk and that is protesting in the streets in recent years are disabled folks, disabled Israelis. And they're protesting because, again, their disability pensions are so miserably low, they don't even amount to the equivalent of minimum wage. It's impossible to get by. And so, they're trying to protest, they're taking to the streets, the government refuses to agree to their demands, and this has gone on for years, and you get to the point where people are actually getting out of their wheelchairs and sitting on the ground and blocking traffic. That's how desperate they've become. So, what's happening while there's so many people suffering in Israel, suffering economically, and I'm talking about in Jewish Israeli society? What does the government say? What does Netanyahu do? His response, he says about Israel's economic situation, if we take away the ultra-Orthodox in the Arabs, our situation is excellent. Okay, I think I understand where you're going with this. So basically, we're playing the game, blame the Arabs. That's where you want to go with this, Mr. Netanyahu. Okay, let's look at another example that plagues Israeli society. A couple years ago, you may have heard in the news that there were these crazy wildfires that swept across the country. Large forests were just decimated. And, it got quite bad. It actually reached populated areas. People had to be evacuated from their homes. Of course, massive amount of environmental damage and property damage. And so what was the cause of this? What was the reason for this? Why did this happen? Well, there's lots of reasons for it. And the reasons aren't hard to discern. if you look at charts from that very week, we see that throughout the Mediterranean basin, all over the countries of Southern Europe and Northern Africa, all experienced record high heat waves. And that was just that week, but it's also the entire year. It was so dry that NASA itself proclaimed, quote, that Earth's 2016 surface temperatures were the warmest since modern record keeping began. And of course, there's another reason for those wildfires, and that's that a lot of the country is covered in pine trees. Now, what's the reason for that? We have to be honest about it. Pine trees are not native to Israel. There's no reason why such large areas of the country would be covered in pine trees. The reason why it is that way is because they were planted there on purpose, because of the coverage that they give on purpose in order to cover up a crime, the crime of the Nakba. In 1948, when Israel was established, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, the majority of the Palestinian population, was forced out of the country and driven out of their villages. And then these villages were essentially evidence of that ethnic cleansing. And so the government planted these forests, these pine forests, in order to cover up the ruins of these villages so there would be no evidence. So because pine trees are so easy to light on fire, that's the reason why these wildfires took off, among other reasons. The fire services themselves in Israel reported that, quote, there's no way to prove that any of the 9 fires were the result of arson. But what does Netanyahu say? He comes to the site of the fires and he oversees what's going on, and he proclaims, quote, we are facing arson terrorism. So once again, blame the Arabs. That's his MO. Okay. Now, this may be coming as something of a shock to you because perhaps here in Norway, you maybe have this vision of Netanyahu as something very different than the creature that he is. Maybe you're thinking of the Netanyahu of 20 years ago. The first time that Netanyahu was elected to become prime minister of Israel, he ran on this basis. His slogan, his campaign slogan was Netanyahu Osim Shalom Batuach, Netanyahu making a secure peace. Because at that time, during the Oslo era, the expectation was that Israel was on a trajectory in which it would make peace with the Palestinians. So Netanyahu had to speak to the zeitgeist of the time, and he campaigned on a secure peace. But today, this is a completely different Netanyahu. We're living in the post-Trump era, and now there's no more need to speak of peace. The mask falls, and now we see a new Netanyahu. And these are just a few of the quotes of things he said in recent years, give you a sense of where he's taking the country. Surround all of Israel with fences and barriers? Yes, we must defend ourselves against the wild beasts. Now, speaking to one of his political allies with whom he rules the country, he said to Moshe Kahlon, the finance minister, you'll never get the Mizrahi vote, the Arab-Jewish vote. Only I know how to get it. I know who they hate. The non-Jewish Arabs. They hate the Arabs. So, openly speaking of it, this is a tactic that he uses. He openly incites racism for political gain, knowing that this will actually increase his numbers in the polls. And of course, when it comes to the polls, on the day of the election, he actually has the audacity to go onto Facebook and record himself saying straight up, Arab voters are streaming in droves to the polling stations. We have only an emergency army call-up. Defend Israel. So the very fact that Palestinian citizens of Israel are exercising their democratic right to vote, ostensibly Israel is a democracy, but when actually they're using their right to vote and affect this democracy, Adkan, no. Come on, Jews, we got to stop the Palestinians from actually affecting the election. This is the discourse. He says, we need to control all of the territory for the foreseeable future. We will live forever by the sword. This is the future that he promises us. Whatever the situation is, the area west of the Jordan, that includes the Palestinian areas would be militarily under Israel. So all of Israel, the West Bank, everything, it's all going to be controlled by Israel. We are here to stay forever. There will be no more uprooting of settlements in the land of Israel. So no two-state solution. It's off the table and long gone, frankly. Now, okay, we're in the post-Trump era, as I said. And when Trump was elected, the first place that he visited outside, the first time that he stepped out of the United States, he came to the Middle East and he visited Israel. And when he came to Israel, he gave a speech. And at that speech, there was something really interesting that happened. I'm sure it wasn't reported in the Norwegian media, but it wasn't even reported in English, frankly, but it was reported in Hebrew. So I'm going to give you a little, again, behind the scenes, Israeli discourse decoded. So at that time, as the people who attended the speech were filing out of the area, and they were conversing with one another, so there was an interesting conversation between Natan Eshel, who is Netanyahu's chief of staff prior, and Ophir Akunis, who is Israel's Minister of Science and Technology. So they're walking out of Trump's speech, and Ophir Akunis starts off. He says, "Man, what a speech. Trump actually joined the Likud." That's the Likud party, that's Netanyahu's political party. So he's so right-wing. He's not trying to be, two sides or, he's actually on, not just on Israel's side, he's on Netanyahu's side, on the right wing of Israel. And he says, a wonderful correction to the Bar Ilan speech. So now I have to parse this for you and explain what he's talking about. Bar Ilan is a university in Israel. It's a university affiliated with the settler movement, with the right wing in Israel. And when Netanyahu was re-elected to be prime minister almost a decade ago in 2009, at that point, people were already starting to suspect. They weren't sure which direction he was going to go in, Is he going to, advocate for a two-state solution, or is he going to go straight for, endless apartheid? So he comes out the gate and he gives a speech at Bar Ilan University in which he says, quote, that his vision is for two free peoples living side by side in this small land with good relations, each with its flag, anthem, and government. Okay, on the face of it, he's giving the impression that he supports two states. So that's the Bar Ilan speech. Now, back to after Trump visits Israel. So the conversation, remember, Bar Ilan speech, a wonderful correction to the Bar Ilan speech. Then Natan Eshel, Netanyahu's advisor, chief of staff, responds, the Bar Ilan speech was my idea. I knew it would give us a lot of silence. I told Netanyahu, you have to either talk or act. Look how much silence that talking got us. So, in black and white, here you have it. It was all a ruse. It was complete deception. Okay? The fact that he said, I advocate a two-state solution, that was only to pull the wool over your eyes so that you would believe him and allowed him to continue doing what he does best, oppressing Palestinian people. And that's why in recent years we have top Israeli general Gadi Shamni saying, we've elevated the occupation to an art form. We are the world champions of occupation. And this is why also we see in recent years, last year rather, Avigdor Lieberman, who is the defense minister of Israel, he says, talking about the construction of settlements in the occupied West Bank, Jewish-only settlements, he says that the numbers for the first half of 2017 are the highest since 1992. So in other words, the highest in a quarter century. More settlement construction than at any point in the last quarter century. That's where we're at now. So there's no two-state solution, and there's no aspiration towards a two-state solution. There's only full-fledged apartheid. Now, this is what that looks like in practice, the construction of Jewish-only settlements. So you see construction equipment, bulldozers coming in, demolishing a Palestinian village, and Israeli security forces arrayed in front to ensure that no one can interfere with that demolition. Okay? And of course, the Palestinian villagers themselves, powerless, unable to do anything about it, standing on the side, witnessing, watching their village being destroyed. Now the thing is, these images that I'm showing you are not even in the West Bank. Okay? This isn't occupied territory. This is so-called, Israel proper, 1948 Israel. This is the village of al-Khiran, which is just a few kilometers from where I live, in southern Israel. So, if you can imagine this, the government comes in, is demolishing the Palestinian village and building a Jewish village right on top of its ruins. Right on top of it. And when the Palestinian villagers learned of this, they're like, look, we've got no problem with Jewish people. You want Jewish people to live here? They're welcome to. We've got no problems with Jews as our neighbors. They're welcome to move into the village and live with us here. But the government said no. We want only Jews here. And if you look at the manifesto for that village, the Jewish village that will be built on top of the ruins of al-Khiran, the manifesto specifies that the only people who can live there are, quote, Jewish Israeli citizens who observe the Torah according to the values of Orthodox Judaism. This is in Israel, not the West Bank. So that's in the south of the country. Now we're going to move to the north of the country. All right, we're going to talk about what it's like for Palestinian people. Now, the government doesn't allow Palestinian villages and towns to expand. Of course, you have kids have kids. They got to live somewhere. You've got to be able to build new neighborhoods. The government doesn't allow it because it doesn't want Palestinian people to be able to thrive. And so, curtailed and unable to expand their villages, eventually some people say, okay, well, if Israel is ostensibly a democracy, there shouldn't be any reason why I can't move to that village, that Jewish village there, just a few kilometers down the road, right? And so they do. And so as the city of Nazareth has been strangled and not allowed to expand, some of the Palestinian residents of Nazareth, Christian and Muslim Palestinians, they've moved to Upper Nazareth, the Jewish town that was built originally to Judaize the Galilee. So, over time, for the last few years, we now see that the population of Upper Nazareth is about 20-25% Palestinian citizens of Israel. And of course, living in town, they want the right to be able to educate their children according to their culture. They speak Arabic, that's their mother tongue. They want their children to be educated in Arabic and to learn their own language and their own culture. But the mayor of Upper Nazareth refuses to allow them to do so. He will not allow any school, any Arabic language school to be established in his town. He doesn't want Palestinian people living there at all. And when he runs for re-election, if you can imagine this, the campaign that he runs on, and you can see it in Hebrew on his campaign posters, specifically say, no more sticking to the law that allows any citizen to live wherever they want to. So unabashedly, I can hardly imagine even some of the most far-right racists in Norway openly stating these kinds of things. But in Israel, this is par for the course. Now, okay, you'll tell me, well, this is a municipal official. That's small-time politics. What about at the federal level, the national level? Is it that bad? Well, you decide for yourself. So, that's ruling Likud party, in Upper Nazareth. But now we're looking at the Likud representation in the Knesset, in Israel's parliament. So Miki Zohar, backbencher of the ruling Likud party, he says, the state of Israel can very easily, in a few decades, become a democratic state. Become? I thought Israel was supposed to be a democracy. He's worried that Israel is going to become a democracy. He says, if we give up on the Jewish idea, our descendants could end up living in a democratic state. He's petrified at the possibility. He says, when the state of Israel turns democratic, then there will be an existential threat to the Jewish people. I mean, I don't even know what to say anymore. Is your vision of Judaism and Jewish culture so small that you perceive democracy as an existential threat? I mean, that really says something. So, but maybe you'll say, okay, this guy's a backbencher. This is his first time around in the Knesset. Let's, go see what they're saying. Those members of Knesset who've been around the block a couple times. And okay, fair enough. So Danny Danon, for example, he's been in the Knesset for a few terms now. He's now Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, so Israel's top envoy. What does he have to say? Well, he says, the biggest problem in the state of Israel is the Arabs of Israel. Okay, I see a pattern here. This doesn't look good. Okay, but still, maybe Likud wasn't always as racist. Maybe if we go back to those elders, those old-time Likud ministers, from the heyday, maybe they have more moderate language. So let's look at perhaps Tzachi Hanegbi, someone who's been around the block a time or two. And he, just a few months ago, when Palestinians were protesting, he had the audacity to say on his Facebook page, remember 48, remember 67. When you want to stop protesting, it'll be too late. It'll already be after the third Nakba. So for those who aren't familiar with the discourse, again, 48, that's 1948, the year that Israel was established and most Palestinians driven out of the land. 1967, the Six-Day War, when Israel conquered the West Bank and more Palestinians were dispossessed. So the two catastrophes, greatest catastrophes of modern Palestinian history. And he's saying, if you keep protesting, you're going to be driven out a third time. These are Israel's political leaders. But it gets worse if we look at the religious leaders. So, take, for example, Ovadia Yosef. He's a pretty typical representative of this line of thinking. Just so you can understand who we're talking about, this man was the chief rabbi of Israel, and he's dead now. He died a couple years ago. If you can imagine this, when he died, his funeral was attended by 800,000 people. It was the largest funeral ever in the history of the country. So obviously, someone who commands a great deal of respect. So, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, he says about non-Jews in general, Goyim were only born to serve us. Without that, they have no place in the world. Goyim obviously is a derogatory term for non-Jews. Okay, this is what he thinks about you. So that's, the chief rabbi. Now we're the new chief rabbi, the son of the chief rabbi. So Ovadia Yosef's son, Yitzchak Yosef, is now the current chief rabbi of Israel. And he says, just last year, he says, according to Jewish law, it is forbidden for a non-Jew to live in the land of Israel. Okay, so the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Again, personally, I think people should have the right to say racist statements, no matter how racist they are. I believe in the principle of free speech, as an absolute value. But that's not what we're talking about here. He can say that as a private citizen. You can't say that with my tax money. Your salary is paid for by my taxes. You can say that as a private citizen, but not as a public servant. And so that's the current chief rabbi of Israel. And now we're looking at Shmuel Eliyahu, who, again, a chief rabbi of the holy city of Tzfat. He was the runner-up to be the chief rabbi of all of Israel, and also the son of a former chief rabbi of Israel. So you can see how the dynasties go down. So in the holy city of Tzfat in the north, he declared that it is a sin against God to sell or even rent an apartment to non-Jew. Now, this has serious implications. The city of Tzfat, there's a college there, and as such, there's people who come from all around the area to study at the college, and Palestinian villages as well. So, as I said, Palestinian citizens of Israel make up about 20-25% of the country. So some of them move to town so that they can attend the college. And of course, when they do so, they need a place to live. So they look for rental apartments. But because the chief rabbi of the city has declared that it's a sin against God, so they have a hard time finding rentals. And when they do find someone willing to rent to them, this is what happens. If you can imagine this man happens to be a Holocaust survivor. He decided to rent out a part of his home for one of these, for some of these students. And the students who came to him happened to be Palestinian citizens of Israel. And he rented it out. But then once local youth found out who he was renting his apartment to, they threatened him that they would burn his house down if he rented the apartment to non-Jews. And so, what choice did he have? An old man on his own, he eventually relented and told the students, I'm sorry, I won't be able to rent to you. So in this way they win. The racists win. So what I'm saying is that if these aren't just words that have no effect, these have practical effects on people's lives. This is what's actually happening. Now, if you look at the letter, the religious edict that he authored, which incidentally was then co-signed by hundreds of chief rabbis around the country, the chief rabbis of cities throughout the country. So if we look at the text, his justification for why it's a sin against God to rent apartments to non-Jews is based on, because God says we must ethnically cleanse the country of non-Jews. So straight up referencing calls to ethnic cleansing. And more to the point, referencing the fact that because if we rent apartments and then Jews and non-Jews live in some proximity, there's a danger of miscegenation. Now, I don't even know if people know that word. Not even every English speaker knows it. It's archaic because thankfully we haven't had to use it in so long because it's no longer part of the public discourse. Thankfully, in many societies, we rightfully reject that concept. What I'm talking about is so-called race mixing. The idea that romantic relationships between Jews and non-Jews are anything but, perfectly fine. But to him, they're a sin against God and they must be prevented at any cost. And so we see that this discourse, this anti-miscegenation discourse, is actually very popular in Israel. So at the political level, we have one of the political parties in Israel, Shas, actually campaigning. I walk to a local restaurant just down the block from my house, and they have flyers there hanging that people are handing out in anticipation of the previous round of elections. And this is what the flyer says. Here, I'll translate it into English for you so you can see the kinds of discourse that I'm confronted with. Only a strong Shas will prevent miscegenation. So they're actively campaigning. Do you too despise mixed marriages? Then vote for us. We will ensure that they are stamped out. This is a campaign for Knesset. Of course, no shocker, religious affairs minister, head of the education committee, says we must protect the Jewish nation from miscegenation. It's a strategic threat. And we see the deputy defense minister, Eli Ben-Dahan, he goes another step further. If you can imagine this, he has the chutzpah to say that mixed marriages are a silent holocaust. I mean, this is unfathomable. We think of so-called mixed marriages, Romeo and Juliet, right? Star-crossed lovers, people from two different camps who, against all odds, fall in love with one another and decide to spend their lives together. We should praise that. We should, be awed by that. But instead, this minister is equating mixed marriages with genocide. He's saying that interracial relationships are equivalent to the genocide of the Jews. This is how sick it gets. So, with his party in government and in control of the education ministry, the government begins to ban books in recent years. Books that discuss miscegenation or in which romantic relationships between non-Jews feature as part of the plot line. So they've actually removed these books from the reading lists of high schoolers. These two books, one in which a Jewish man falls in love with a non-Jewish with a Palestinian woman, and one in which a Jewish woman falls in love with a Palestinian man, they're banned from the reading list, removed from the reading list. For heaven forbid the Jewish youth learn that this is a possibility. And again, it's not only about, eclipsing them, it's also about actively fighting against families like this. So the Jewish Home Party, what it does is it funds reverse colonizers. I don't know of any other way to describe it. So we know that, for years, the Israeli government, especially the far right, has been funneling money to groups of Orthodox Jews who colonize the West Bank. Okay? They'll send to hilltops overlooking Palestinian towns, and they'll set them up on settlements to control the land and to further dispossess Palestinian people. But all of a sudden, they're starting to realize, but there's another danger. Back in Israel proper, we're worried because even though almost all the country is segregated by race and religion, almost everyone lives in a town that's almost all Jewish or almost all Palestinian. Still, there are a few towns in the country where Palestinians and Jews actually live side by side with one another, like Haifa, like Jerusalem, like Jaffa. And so these religious settlers are now thinking that that's the problem that they must combat. The fact that Jews and Palestinians live together in some measure of peace is something they want to stamp out. So these West Bank settlers recolonize Israel proper, move to these so-called mixed towns, and they establish these groups with the avowed intention of stamping out miscegenation. This is some of the literature that they pass out. So again, I'll translate into English for your benefit. In Jaffa, there are mixed marriages in almost every building. We must stop the miscegenation. So they move into these neighborhoods and campaign against coexistence. This is our reality. So of course, despite, and the thing is, these marriages amount to such a small number. Almost all, as I said, segregation is the norm. But even though there's so few families like this, it's still the enemy to them. And so, against all odds, on occasion, it does in fact happen. And this is one of those examples where Moral and Mahmoud grew up in Jaffa, met and decided to spend their lives together. Now, I would say she's Jewish and he's Palestinian, but that's actually not the case because in Israel, we don't determine religion by spiritual beliefs. We determine it on a racial basis. So in Israel, the government does not allow people to get married if they're of different religions. There's no way to do so legally. Of course, there's loopholes. You can fly to Oslo City Hall, get married there, and then once you have a document from outside the country, you can move back to the country, and then the state accepts it as a fait accompli. But in Israel itself, there's no way to do that. If you don't have the money to fly your family to some other country that has civil marriage, you're out of luck. Well, I guess you could live together cohabitate as a couple. But in any case, it's in order to prevent miscegenation. So I'm not saying she's Jewish. I'm going to say she's the daughter of Jews, the daughter of people who are registered as Jews, according to the state. And Mahmoud is the son of Muslim citizens of Israel. So a daughter of Jewish citizens and a son of Muslim citizens meet, fall in love, decide they want to spend their lives together. But when they have a ceremony to celebrate their union, that wedding party is actually protested by hundreds of Israeli Jews outside the wedding hall, screaming death to the Arabs, Mavet la'Aravim. I actually filmed this, so if you're interested, you can go onto my YouTube channel and look it up. Not pleasant viewing. So you see the sign they're holding up there. Intermarriage is a Holocaust for the Jewish people. Now, the group that protested, they're called Lehava. They're a paramilitary patrol. They patrol these mixed cities, areas of Israel where they fear that Jews and non-Jews might come into contact with one another, and they want to prevent that from occurring. So they'll come to downtown Jerusalem on a Thursday night, on a Saturday night, where people are out in the streets, and they'll harass them, and they'll harangue them if they see people hanging out with one another, until they just drive them right out of the area. And this is the leader of that group, Benzi Gopstein. Now, just to give you a sense of how far gone these guys are, he was on a panel of rabbis, and he was asked by these rabbis directly, are you in favor of burning churches in the land of Israel? Yes or no? Sounds like a pretty straightforward question. And he answered straight up, you have to burn. Yes, of course. Simply yes. Why are you even asking? You have any doubt? this is their agenda. Now, again, it's not only words. These things actually happen in Israel. Okay? We see that churches are actually burned. And it's not only that they burn and then we don't know what happened and it could have been anything. No, the perpetrators leave graffiti at the scene of the crime so we can easily read into their intentions. Notzrim lazazel, Christians go to hell. Erase the name and the memory of the bastard Jesus. The revenge of the Jews is coming. And of course, it's not only Christian places of worship, it's also Muslim places of worship, mosques. And sickeningly, it's even schools, those few schools, because as I said, segregation is almost complete. But again, there are a few schools, a handful, 5, 6, 7, just a handful, but those few schools where Jewish kids and Palestinian kids actually study together. It's such a rarity, but even that rarity is so offensive to these supremacists that they torched one of these schools, a grade 1 classroom, if you can imagine this. And again, there's no question mark over their intentions. They left graffiti, and I'll translate it for you. No coexistence with cancer. No miscegenation. Now, eventually they were caught, and of course, no shame around it, brought to trial. You go to their Facebook pages, and they say it unabashedly. Death to the Arabs. We're sick of them. A Holocaust should be done to them. After they were arrested, the mother of one of these arsonists, she said straight up, if it wasn't for the law, I would have done it too. Jews and Arabs learning together is disgusting. And then you wonder why there's miscegenation. This is the discourse. Now, eventually they were convicted of the crime and sentenced to 2 years in jail. Of course, as they were being led out of the courtroom, they were singing praises to Yahweh. And they said, yes, it was worth it. And the truth is, it was worth it. They made it worth it for them. This group, these members of Lehava, well, Lehava, until a few years ago, they were actually funded by the government of Israel. It's only because of the work of Uri Blau, a colleague at Haaretz, who investigated and discovered this, that they were actually getting funds from the government, that at that point, okay, that's kind of embarrassing, we're caught with our pants down, so they ended that funding source. But they quickly moved on to equally, another funding source that is, if not equally disgusting, even more so. We see that this woman, Miriam Falik, has become the primary funder of this anti-miscegenation brown shirt group, Lehava. Who is this woman, Miriam Falik? She's an American citizen. In addition to being the number one funder of Lehava, she's also the number one funder of the Israeli army. You're posing with, till not too long ago, the chief of staff of the Israeli army. And she's also the number one funder of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's election campaigns. A person who funds his campaigns to run in internal Likud party elections. So she's got the whole trifecta. This is how close they are to the reins of power in Israel. This is not, yes, perhaps Benzi Gupstein himself is marginal, but he has access to the highest levels of government. And again, not only on the political sphere, also on the religious sphere. So the Yosef family of chief rabbis of Israel, that rabbinical dynasty, they are also supportive of Gopstein's work. When they recently met with him a couple weeks ago, they said, don't stop your holy work. That this is holy work. So again, it's not just about screaming, yelling, chasing away Palestinian people, non-Jewish people. This is actually taking place, actually carrying out lynches. Okay, so this is the city hall of Petah Tikva, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv. A couple years ago, and we only know this because there were CCTV cameras at City Hall, so they filmed the whole thing. So we see that an African refugee, a non-Jewish man, who had come from Darfur, who had fled the fighting in Darfur, made it to Israel after living in Israel a few years. So he's walking down the streets, and he sees a group of teenagers, as you can see, and he exchanges a few words with them. After 10 seconds, it's quite clear to him that they're not interested in continuing to converse, so he's like, okay, forget it. He walks away. Again, it's all on CCTV camera, so this is how we know it. So 10 seconds of conversation, he walks away. Within seconds, these youths pounce on him. How dare you speak to Jewish girls? How dare you, a non-Jew, dare speak to them? They jumped on him, and they beat him, and they beat him, and they beat him. And they beat him so, well, eventually the police showed up, or the ambulance showed up, and they had a look at him and realized, well, I guess he doesn't need our help, and then they took off. And then within seconds, the youths returned to the scene and continued to beat him, and beat him for an hour and a half outside of City Hall. And they beat him to death. And they beat him so badly that his face was mush. His own brother could not recognize him. Was unable to recognize him, his own brother. And the only reason he was able to retrieve the body afterwards was because he noticed that a few of his fingers had been severed. Because back in Darfur, in the ethnic cleansings that he had fled, he had lost a couple of his fingers, and so, or the extensions of his fingers, the last parts of his fingers. And so that only in that way was he able to recognize that this was in fact his brother. That's how badly they beat him. And they got off without murder charges. Those boys that beat him, their charges were reduced to manslaughter for lynching a black man. And again, this is not the only case of an African refugee who was lynched in Israel in recent years. The year before that, this young man, also an African refugee from Eritrea, again, this is going to be disturbing, but I have no choice but to show it to you so you can understand the ramifications. He was beaten by a mob of Israelis in a public bus station, beaten to death. Now, just a couple weeks ago, the prosecution in Israel told his murderers, well, we're willing to let you off with just community service. They lynched a black man on camera, and the government was willing to, give them nothing more than community service. But they had the audacity to refuse the deal offered to them. They don't even think that they deserve to do community service for murdering a black man. And maybe they're right in the sense that they think that they could get a better deal in a courtroom. They may not have to even face that sentence. Well, we'll see what happened. The case is pending. But of course, it's not only African refugees. In recent years, we know the story of Muhammad Abu Khder, this young Palestinian teenager standing outside his parents' home in East Jerusalem. And he was kidnapped by a group of Jewish supremacists. They beat him. They poured petrol down his throat. And they burned him to death from the inside out. Now, of course, I'm not trying to suggest in any way, shape, or form that this is like all Israelis agree with this, support this, would be capable of doing such a heinous crime. Of course, this shook many people in the country, including this minister of the government. Amir Peretz was so shocked at what had happened, he decided to pay a condolence call to the Abu Khder family. And when he did that, and it was reported on the Israeli media, then you have people commenting, Israelis going onto Facebook saying, I hope your children, your family will be murdered for daring to make a condolence call to the family. And of course, he wasn't the last Palestinian that faced this fate. So the following year, when the Dawabshe family was murdered, those same Israelis went onto the internet, took a photo of Muhammad and wrote, Abu Khder 2, Abu Khder 2. Now in theaters and in reruns on television, Abu Khder 2. In this incident, a group of Jewish supremacists went into the West Bank village of Duma. For no reason, they had done nothing, but they just wanted to murder Palestinian people, send a message to the government that they're going to stay there and they're going to drive the Palestinian people off their land. So they went up to this house and they firebombed it in the middle of the night. And of course, we know their intentions. They left graffiti at the scene. Yechi Melech HaMashiach, long live the King, the Messiah. Nekama, vengeance. And they murdered the father, the mother, and the 1-year-old baby, Ali. it doesn't get much worse than burning to death a 1-year-old baby boy. Of course, as I said, this isn't every Israeli or every Jewish person in the country, far from it. Of course, there's people who are disgusted by these acts of vicious terrorism. And right after the burning of the Dawabshe family, a mayor of a town in Israel, David Evansur, he went onto Facebook and he wrote this message. He said, "Around us, we are seeing more and more displays of hatred and violence that make us all cringe. This is the time to remember the most important commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself. Let's stop hating, and as it says in the book of Psalms, turn from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it." Well, I appreciate that he had the courage to come out and say something like that, and it's no small thing to do so, because when you say something like that in Israel today, you can expect to face serious repercussions. He said that on Friday. He posted that on Facebook on a Friday. By Saturday, his car was torched. People came and burnt his car, sending him the message that this is what you can expect if you speak out against us. Now, obviously, a great disincentive to speak out. This isn't you're going to ask yourself why this is happening. Why aren't these people brought to justice? Well, don't take it from David Sheen, all right? Take it, in this case, from the heads of Israel's security services. So Israel's FBI, the Shin Bet, this is Carmi Gilon, who's former head of the Shin Bet. He says, talking about Israel allowing anti-Palestinian hate crimes, he says, in the Shin Bet, there's no such thing as we can't do it. Only we don't want to do it. So they're fully capable. I mean, this is the Israeli Secret Service. They're quite capable of catching their man if they want to. But they don't want to. There's no such thing as we can't, only we don't want to, he says, talking about this issue. And again, Yuval Diskin, another former head of the Shin Bet, says something quite similar. Now and forever, there's been a total lack of will to tackle this issue at the political level. So, as I said, Israeli Secret Service able to do so, able to stop them if they only wished, but they don't wish because the politicians don't want them to. Again, another top security official, this is Shabtai Shavit, the former head of the Mossad, Israel's CIA. And he says that Israel is a lawful country that does not enforce its laws. So yes, there are hate crimes, right, on the books, but they're just not enforced. So people who commit them know that they can get away with them, and that's why they continue. And again, this isn't just theoretical. So after the murder of the Dawabshe family, there was no action. We waited days, weeks, months. Nothing happened. No suspects. What's up? Well, Moshe Yaalon, the defense minister of Israel at that time, he said that the security services, they know who's responsible, but has chosen to prevent legal recourse to protect the identity of their sources. So I'll parse this for you. What does this mean? So Israel's defense minister is saying, we know who committed the crime, and the reason we know is because we have spies in their networks. We have people who have infiltrated these terrorist groups, and so therefore we know who's responsible. But we don't want to use that information because we prefer to keep them embedded there for a little while longer. Like, what are you waiting for? The murder of a father, mother, and 1-year-old baby isn't enough? Is enough of a reason to use that evidence that you have? You still want to keep it in the dark? For what? And, of course, when people learned this, they were, outraged. And so a Palestinian member of the Knesset, he actually had to sue the Israeli government. He actually had to go to the Supreme Court to force the Israeli government to bring these people to justice. So, they go to the court, he gets an injunction, okay, the government realizes there's nothing it can do about it, it should comply, so it does, and it brings these people to court, it charges them with the murder of the Dawabshe family. But again, there's people for whom there's no shame around it. They're not ashamed. They're proud of it, just the opposite. So at the court case where these people are facing trial for the murder, you have their friends coming to the court, throwing down symbols. This isn't a gang sign, this is 3. He's saying, father, mother, 1-year-old baby. We got him, all 3, in your face. And at their weddings of these Jewish extremists, they actually, if you can imagine this, dance with a Molotov cocktail and a photograph of baby Ali, that 1-year-old baby boy that they burned to death. Celebrating it at their most joyous occasions, at their weddings. They're celebrating the murder of this family. This is what we've come to. Now, again, bad enough that there's people who do it, but in every society there's some crazy psychos who are going to commit vigilante violence. We can't, condemn all of Israeli society for this. Fair enough. But when Israeli youth are asked what they think about these anti-Palestinian hate crimes, when they ask about these so-called price tag attacks, a mere 28% of the Jewish Israeli youth oppose this and condemn these attacks. So that means that 72% of Jewish Israeli youth aren't willing to outright condemn these attacks. That's a very, very, very sad statistic, let's say. So what's the reason for this? How do we get to the point where so many Jewish youth in Israel are just blasé about the whole situation and aren't really perturbed by this kind of racist violence? Well, I'd say that there's a couple reasons for it in my analysis. I'd say one of them is that the government is preaching, is getting kids to the point where they're desensitized to violence. So you have the government actually sending in soldiers and sending in police officers, sending in its armed forces into the schools, even to elementary schools, to get the kids used to the idea of weapons of war so that they can just normalize it. And it's not only the weapons of war. Sadly, this is also the wounds of war. So when Israel just had its Independence Day, so-called, the day that Israel celebrates its founding, you actually have events where soldiers come out and paint fake wounds on the children. To me, this is completely age inappropriate. I don't see how this is a celebration of your nation. But the idea is get them desensitized to the weapons of war and get them desensitized to the wounds of war so that they think that this is just normal, par for the course. So there's that aspect to it. There's desensitizing them to violence. And there's the aspect of preaching racial hatred, getting them to think that they are a race apart and that they are superior. And so just a couple quick photographs from what it's like in Israeli schools. So you have this from a kindergarten in Israel. Mi rotzeh laharog. Again, I'll translate into English. Who wants to kill us? The Arabs, the Nazis. Haiming, what do we need? We need a state. Everyone wants to kill us. That's why we have the state of Israel. This is why we live here, because all non-Jews are murderous and they just want nothing but to genocide us. This is what they're teaching the youth. And again, that's at the youngest level. So then, moving into elementary school, and so they're given these journals so that they can record their schedules and plan their weeks. And so this cartoon appears in this journal that's distributed to Israeli youth. And again, it's in Hebrew, but I'll translate it for your benefit. So these 2 young boys are talking. And one of them says, "Look, we're the same. Well, I'm a Gentile and you're a Jew. There's no difference between us." Sounds legit. But then the other boy answers him, saying, "True, we look the same. We even have the same name, as Jack is Jacob. Same name. But we are not the same at all, because I have a Torah which guides me to live correctly. A person with Torah and a person without Torah are not the same at all, even if they outwardly appear so." So, this is the kinds of message that the youth are receiving, that they are a race apart. And then as they advance and they're given, reading lists, recommended reading, They have books like this. The Arab Gentiles, we have no desire to have them here among us. These are the kinds of texts that are being recommended to the youth. And this is why the Minister of Social Affairs, until a couple years ago, Mayor Cohen, said straight up, observing that a large part of the students speak with extraordinary racism. We are creating youth that we didn't want to. And again, the Palestinian member of Knesset, Isawi Frej, he obviously is identifying the problem of rampant racism among Israeli youth. And he's like, we got to do something about this. We have to try to stop this. And so he put together a proposal in the Knesset that just 1 hour a week, he wanted to mandate that all Israeli schools, high schools, would, for 1 hour a week, have anti-racist education. That's it, just 1 hour. To somehow bring them back from the brink. Of course, the government voted against the plan, so it was discarded. And this is where we're at today. Now, if until now I've told you about what's actually happening on the ground, I'm just going to say a few more words to give you a sense of what's coming up around the bend, what we can expect in the weeks and the months to come. Sadly, even worse. So as I said, if we talked about the ruling Likud party, now we're going to have a few more words about the Jewish Home Party faction of the government. So the Jewish Home Party lawmakers, this is Bezalel Smotrich, he's the deputy speaker of the Knesset. Now, as I said, Netanyahu is, implementing full-fledged apartheid, a one-state solution in which Jewish people dominate and Palestinian people are dispossessed, living as citizens minus, or residents minus. But for some people, that's not enough. Some people are perfectly fine that way, living as lords of the land. But for some people, it creates a tension. They don't want to live amongst non-Jews at all. They want the country ethnically cleansed altogether. And so the Jewish Home Party and Bezalel Smotrich, they proposed what he calls his decision plan. Okay, I have a different name for it. I call it the ABC plan. Okay, what I mean by that is ABC standing for apartheid, bribe, cleansing. And this is his plan. It's a three-pronged plan. So he starts off with the bribe. He says, my plan is to go to Palestinian people in the West Bank and say to them, you got three options. First option, bribe. Here you go. Here's a fat check. Take this money and run. Get your family together and move out of the country. Leave and don't come back. You can leave peacefully, and you've even got a check to start a new life somewhere else in the world. That's your first option. You don't like that? You don't want to leave? Okay. Option number 2, apartheid. You want to stay here? You can stay here, but no more this temporary occupation. We are instituting full-fledged apartheid. From now on, you have a subset of rights. You will never be as, you will not have the same rights as Jewish people. Jewish people will be officially the lords of the land, and you will have some smaller set of rights. Full-on apartheid. You don't want apartheid, you're not willing to leave the country, and you're not willing to stay with a smaller set of rights? Okay, and then we move to C, cleansing, outright. If you're not willing to accept your lower status, then we will drive you out of the land altogether. And again, it's not like this is one crazy guy who comes up with a plan and he's marginal on the... No. At the conference in which he announced his plan, Prime Minister Benjamin at the conference in which he announced his plan, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu actually he sent a video greeting so that all the people who came to hear about this apartheid plan, about this ABC plan, he called to welcome them to this event. So this is a sanctioning, it's a stamp of approval from Netanyahu himself. In response to that, the Hebrew University professor, expert on Holocaust studies, Daniel Blattman, he said that Smotrich, the proposer of that law, is the most senior government figure to say unabashedly that the option of genocide is on the table. So this is where we are. This is what's coming up around the bend in Israeli society. Now, that's one wing of the Jewish Home Party. In the other wing of the Jewish Home Party, we have this parliamentarian, Moti Yogev. And Moti Yogev, he says, we need to bulldoze the Supreme Court. This is his plan. Now, of course, that's bluster. I don't think he's actually going to get in in a tractor trailer and drive over the Supreme Court, but his intention is pretty much the same. He wants to neuter the Supreme Court, and his reasoning for this is as such. Now, some people will say that, again, I'm not really familiar with the Norwegian system of government, but my assumption is that it's not so dissimilar from other countries in which you have a legislature and an executive and a judiciary. And so the legislature, the lawmakers pass laws, but eventually those laws, before they can be executed, they have to pass the muster of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court could say, no, that's unconstitutional. That law goes too far. It contradicts the Bill of Rights. And so we are calling it off. We are canceling that law. That's the idea of a balance of powers. And because of that, a bunch of people, including Moti Yogev, feel that the Supreme Court is like the last bastion of liberalism in Israel, that they're the last shred of liberal democracy. I don't feel that way, actually. I have a different take on it. Because what ends up happening in practice is, okay, the government passes another law and another racist law and another racist law, and every time they pass a racist law, so this comes eventually to the Supreme Court, and in the end, so that... you know what, that's just a little bit too racist for our taste. It's kind of hard to stomach. You know what, why don't we just remove this clause and edit this wording and somewhat modify this text, and all right, here it goes, right back to you. Now that I've explained to you, all you got to do is make these edits, and then you can pass the second or third version of the law. It's just as racist as the original version, but because you made a few modifications, we'll let it slip by. And now it passes the muster of the Supreme Court. So in the end, the Supreme Court isn't the last bastion of liberalism in Israel. It's just the launderer of the worst excesses of the government. It means that the racist agenda of the government still is implemented. It just takes a little while longer. Okay, so instead of a few weeks, it takes a few months or a couple of years, but it happens. That's, in my mind, the true role of the Israeli Supreme Court. But that's not enough for them. They are frustrated. The racist right in Israel is frustrated that it takes that long. They want to be able to push through their racist agenda ASAP. They don't want to have to go through that legal rigmarole. So they say, we want to neuter the Supreme Court altogether and strip from it the right to be able to call laws unconstitutional. And so this is the idea of this new policy that they're proposing to bulldoze the Supreme Court in a legal sense. And again, it's not just one person on the fringes of Israel's parliament. We have Shuli Mualim, who is the whip of the Jewish Home Party, also co-sponsoring the law. And we have other religious members of parliament co-sponsoring it. But it's not only the religious parties, it's also the so-called secular parties, the ruling Likud party, like, for example, Nurit Koren from the Likud party, and not only her, lots of other members of the Likud party also co-sponsoring this law. Okay, so it has quite a wide base of support in the Israeli government, this idea. But did they write the law? Did they author the law? Were they the person? No. In fact, it turns out, wait a second, they're all standing behind this podium. What's that logo there? Where are they all gathered together to announce this law? Turns out, this group, Derech Hayim, is one of the most sinister groups in Israel, led by this man, Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg. Turns out that those lawmakers, they may be the ones putting the bill into parliament, but they're not the ones who authored it. The author of that law is this man and this group. Who is Yitzchak Ginsburg, you ask? Well, this is one of the most disturbing things that I'm going to tell you tonight. So, he is the man who is the spiritual godfather of the dominionist movement in Israel. He is the rabbi who lent his seal of approval, who published Torat HaMelech, this book, the King's Torah. It was published about a decade ago in Israel, and he is the guru who sponsored it. And what is this book, Torat HaMelech, the King's Torah? I'm sickened to say, but it's no less than a Gentile murdering manual, or to be more specific, a Gentile baby murdering manual. And what I mean by that is, it's a theological treatise. So the author of the book, they ask the question, a theoretical, not so theoretical sadly, but they ask the question, from a religious perspective, under what circumstances is a Jew permitted to kill a non-Jew? This is the thrust of the book. And the authors of the book write there that there is justification for killing babies if it is clear that they will grow up to harm us. Giving authorization to kill. How do you know that a baby, if it is clear that they're going to grow up to harm you? Of course, this is preposterous. This is just license to murder non-Jewish people, to drive them out of the country altogether. And this is the brains behind these new laws. Now, just so you can understand how far gone we are, what a slippery slope we're on. 5 years ago, in 2013, to be able to get into their conferences, because I've been reporting on racism for no small amount of time now, but when I was trying to find out what was animating them, I had to sneak in. I couldn't just walk in through the front door. I had to climb over fences and go into back alleys and sneak around just to get, because they were so secretive. They were so worried about how they would be perceived, that people would find out what they're all about. But nowadays, 5 years later, the Israeli political, the zeitgeist in Israel is so far gone that they're actually, these dominionist groups are partnering with the government on legislation. They're no longer in the shadows. They're up front. That's how far gone we are. And again, it's not only the theoretical basis, it's actually being put into practice. Okay, so they say it's okay to kill babies, and then Jewish supremacists go out and kill babies, like the 1-year-old baby Ali that they burned to death. This is actually happening. This is what has come of the Knesset. This is what's come of Israel's parliament. And that's why we see increasingly, for example, this is the Israeli parliament, and maybe you've seen photographs of it, and you see this sculpture in the background. It's kind of an iconic photo. So the man, the Israeli artist who actually created that sculpture, responsible for that art, in the last couple of years, he's so ashamed of what's going on in the Knesset. He says, I'm ashamed that I made it. And I've asked a number of times that it be moved or covered with a tapestry. So at this point, some of you may be thinking, okay, David, I'm clear. Netanyahu's government is off the rails. These guys aren't just right. They're not just far right. They're not just further right. They are off the charts. Racist right. But surely, you started off the talk mentioning all these corruption charges against Netanyahu. I mean, surely he must be 1 foot out the door. If they indict, then he'll be replaced. And another party will come into power. Surely there must be an alternative to Netanyahu. What happens on the day he's toppled? And I'm here to tell you that don't get your hopes up. Because even if that happens, first of all, the polls show that despite all these allegations against Netanyahu and all these police investigations, seemingly the Israeli electorate is standing by him, and polls show that he looks to be reelected, even if elections are called. But let's say he's ousted. Who will he be replaced by? What's the alternative? I'm sad to say, not much better. So this is Avi Gabay. He was recently elected to be the leader of the Labour Party, the so-called centrist party that ruled Israel for the first few decades of its existence, and now they're in the opposition. And so with Gabay at the helm, again, just a few of the statements that he's made in the last few months so you can get a sense of the alternative that he offers Israelis. First of all, he says, we will not share a government with the Joint List, period. Let that be clear. So the Joint List is the party of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Okay? Palestinian citizens of Israel, as I said, 20-25% of the country are citizens of Israel, and as such ostensibly have the right to participate. As much as Netanyahu incites against them, they still on paper have the right to participate in Israeli elections. But the people that they elect to represent them, this so-called centrist says, I will never sit in a government with them. I won't even consider it. Let that be clear. He says, I don't deal with the rights of Palestinians. Okay, so what do you deal with, Mr. Gabay? talking about settlements in the occupied West Bank, Jewish-only settlements, he calls them the beautiful and devoted face of Zionism. Talking about a peace deal and those settlements, he says, if a peace deal is made, why do we need to evacuate settlements? He says, I am for settlement blocks, which would include 420,000 settlers from the 480,000. So 88% of the settlers he wants to stay there in occupied Palestine. So this is his vision. This is the centrist alternative to Netanyahu. So much for the two-state solution, right? He's supposedly, ostensibly calling for a two-state solution, but the solution he's talking about is one that Palestinians can never agree to because it's not a two-state solution. It's a, 1 3/4 or 1 1/2 or 1 1/4 state solution. It leaves Palestinians with just Bantustans, with no sovereign state to call their own. That's his solution. Now, he also has some choice words to say about secular Jews, his base. You would think that he would, speak admiringly of secular Jews, but no, because in his effort to get elected, he's trying to appeal to the racist right. He's trying to outflank Netanyahu from the far right. So as over the years, it's, this hasn't started just in recent years. For quite a time, we see even when Netanyahu was first elected to power in 1996, he made it a habit of meeting with some of these rabbis who command large followings. Like this man, he's a revered Kabbalist, Rabbi Kaduri. And so on the eve of the election, Netanyahu would go meet with him and ask for his blessing, with the idea that if this famous, well-loved rabbi blesses him, then all of the rabbi's supporters would also vote for Netanyahu. So back in the day, Netanyahu would say, the left, you should give me your support, Rabbi, because the left, they forgot what it means to be Jewish. They don't know, they're not real Jews. They've forgotten what it means to be Jews. So, that's scandalous enough to delegitimize an entire swath of the population, but now it's not only Netanyahu making these claims. Gabay, in his efforts to, pick off a few votes from the racist right, he says, in 1997, Bibi said that the left has forgotten what it means to be Jewish. Do you know what the left did in response? Forgot how to be Jewish. So now he's joining in with Netanyahu. He's legitimizing this discourse, saying, yes, we have to be religious, we have to be racist, we have to be right-wing. And Gabay isn't charting out some kind of centrist course. He's adopting all of the racist right's discourse. So now, again, I won't get a chance to talk about this too much. I did mention African refugees. And without saying too much about them, we're talking about tens of thousands of people who, as I said, fled Eritrea, fled Sudan, fled ethnic cleansings, fled authoritarian governments. They're fleeing all over the world. It's mainly developing nations that are hosting them. But as you know, here in Norway and other parts of Europe, people are fleeing in every direction and they're trying to find asylum. And so in recent years, tens of thousands have reached Israel. Now, the government, for years, it's been waging a war on them. It's rounded them into camps. It's incited racism against them. And now it's saying, we're going to kick you out of the country. So people are protesting in the streets. They're saying, please don't send us back to the tortures we fled from. But Gabay is adopting the position of Netanyahu. He's agreeing with them. And he's saying, yep, we need to support the government. We need to kick out all the African refugees. Of course, not every Israeli supports that. Some Israeli Jews remember that we too, for a great part of our history, were refugees as well. It seems that it's Gabay who forgot what it means to be Jewish, not secular Jews, not the left. It seems that he's forgotten what it means to be a Jew. Now, one more final word about if it's not Gabay, if it's not the Labour Party, if it's not the so-called centrist alternative to Netanyahu, then what's left? Is there any resistance in Israel? Is there any alternative to this galloping towards Gomorrah? So there are folks in Jewish Israeli society who do aspire, to truly aspire to live in peace with Palestinians. And this is one of these groups. They're called combatants for peace, and they're not hippy dippy, bleeding heart liberals who never served who refused to serve in the army. They're people who served in the army, who grew up as Zionists, spent 3 years in the Israeli military, but then, after having served, came to the conclusion that we need to change direction, we need to work with Palestinian people, we need to chart a shared future. We can't keep making the same mistakes over and over. So they're not just talking to themselves and other Israeli Jews, they're meeting with Palestinian people, and they're trying to figure out how can we live together. Again, not Palestinians who, are in an office somewhere, a bureaucrat, but Palestinians who themselves were combatants, who actually fought, maybe against these same soldiers, Palestinians who were in Palestinian militant groups. And so these Israeli former soldiers and former Palestinian militants meet and try to figure out how they can dissolve these walls of hatred that have been built up over the decades. And one of the ways they do this is on Israel's Memorial Day. Every country has a Memorial Day in which we recognize the lives of those soldiers who died in battle. Of course, historically, we've only recognized the Jewish Israeli soldiers who died, but this group, Combatants for Peace, they said, no, we need to shift. We need to change our ways. And one of the ways we're going to do that is by memorializing all of those who died in these wars, both the Israelis and the Palestinians. All the lives lost, we are going to grieve over everyone whose lives were lost in this conflict. And that's one of the ways that we can start to chart a shared future. So in recent years, we have these Palestinian-Israeli shared memorial events. And of course, I'm grateful that they take the time to do that. It's a shining light. It's an example of what might be. But when they get together, when they assemble to remember these lives lost, we have hundreds of Israelis who come out to protest, to scream at them, yell at them, swear at them, spit at them, throw bottles of urine at them, screaming at them, Nazi cum guzzler, Arab fucker, may your boys be burned and your girls get raped. Go back to Auschwitz. So those few Israelis who have the courage to come together and figure out how Jews and Arabs can live together, this is the rhetoric. This is what they have to deal with. And of course, every society has its psychos. But what is Israel's elected leaders? What do they do in response? Israel's defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, he says about those Jews who come out to those ceremonies, he says, we knew how to defeat the Nazis. We will defeat the forces that act against us from within and without. So those Israeli Jews who aspire to peace, they are the new Nazis. Okay, I've lost the thread here. I mean, who's a Nazi now? This is just off the rails. This is completely bonkers. So just as we say the last few words, because I want to be respectful of your time, but I want to just leave you with one piece of information that maybe will help you make some sense of this slew of examples that I've given you over the last hour and a half, just to kind of frame it in a context that you'll be able to take away with. So a lot of people see the conflict as being a two-sided conflict. They think that there's Israelis and there's Palestinians, or Jews and Arabs, and those are the two sides. And that's the facts on the ground. And I would argue, actually, that it's not especially helpful, and that perhaps we can frame the conflict in another way. And the way that I do that is I break it down into 4 categories. I say that there's 4 political camps in Israel, and each camp represents a different way to relate to other racial religious groups. So I say there's 4 camps, and they make up an acronym, SIDE, S-I-D-E. That's the first letter of each of these 4 political camps. So I say the 4 camps are segregation, integration, domination, and elimination. But these are the 4 political camps in Israel. So just quick explanation of what I mean by this. So the domination camp, that's Netanyahu's camp. That's what's ruling the country at present. His vision is one apartheid state, where Jews are the lords of the land and they dominate Palestinians who have a smaller set of rights. Then there's the elimination camp. They just want to ethnically cleanse the country altogether of non-Jews. That's the Jewish Home Party and their affiliates. And then we have the segregation camp. That's Avi Gabay and the Labour Party, the so-called two-state solution. The idea that Jews should be in one country and Arabs should be in another country and never the twain shall meet. We want segregation of the races and religions. That's the third camp. And the fourth camp is the integration, the one democratic state. People who advocate for one state from the river to the sea, but that shouldn't be an apartheid state. Rather, it should be a true democracy in which all people have equal rights, Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians. And we haven't heard much from that camp. Do they exist? Are they out there? Sure, there are some people. And I think that they deserve our support because they're the only camp that's actually trying to create justice, peace and justice. Now, in other cultures, those folks who step outside of the bounds of the group that they were born into, those people who stand in solidarity with the other, we think of them as heroes. We think of John Brown, the white John Brown who led a slave revolt in the United States, who ticked off the Civil War by raiding a government armory, hoping to take those guns and distribute them to black slaves so that they could rebel. We think of John Brown not as a traitor to the white race, but as a hero, as an example, talking about people from all around the world, including Jews and Palestinians, who left Palestine in the 1930s and other places in the world, and they went to Spain to fight alongside the Republicans, to fight against the forces of fascism in the Spanish Civil War. We think of those people who stepped out of their comfort zone and stood in solidarity with people who are an oppressed people. We think of them as heroes. We think of them as moral exemplars. But in Israel, the people who advocate for equal rights, who want to see a one democratic state, they are vilified in every way possible. And they are called the dirtiest names possible. They're called traitor, race traitor, and they're called Erev Rav. And I'm going to explain what that is. This is the last piece before we end the talk. How are they seen? What does it mean to be Erev Rav? Again, this is a biblical reference, so I have to parse that for you. Erev Rav in the Torah, in the Bible, supposedly they say that in the time of the Exodus from Egypt, that when the Israelites left Egypt, left the shackles of slavery, and became a nation, that at that time, when they achieved their independence, that it wasn't only Israelites who left Egypt, but in fact, some of the people that went into the desert with them were not Israelites at all. They were other people who lived in Egypt, but they felt some solidarity with the Israelites. These newly freed slaves, whether the story is true or not true, or allegory or myth, it doesn't matter. The point is that that's how people remember it. These are the stories, the legends, the tales that we tell ourselves. And so, according to the story, these Erev Rav, this mixed multitude, were non-Israelites who somehow identified with the Israelites and wanted to bind their fates to the fate of the Israelite people. And so, along with them, they were joined by these other people, this mixed multitude, so-called. So what are they saying? What are the modern-day racist right-wingers in Israel saying about the leftists, about the democratic camp? They're saying, you're not Jewish leftists. You're not liberal Jews. You're not Jews who are naive and mistakenly think that Arabs are human beings and that we can live with them in peace. No. You're not just Jews who are bleeding heart liberals. You're race infiltrators. You're not even Jews. You snuck into the Jewish people. You're really non-Jews who infiltrated into the Jewish people. That's what they say about us. That's according to the Torah definition. Of course, when we get to the Talmud definition, it's even crazier. According to the Talmud, this mixed multitude isn't in fact a group of race infiltrators. In fact, they are the progeny of Adam, the first man, and Lilith, a succubus. a demoness. They're saying about those few Jews who support equality in Israel-Palestine, they're saying that they are in fact demon spawn. They are the result of coupling between humans and devils. They're not just demonizing us rhetorically. They are literally demonizing us, saying that we are demons. That if you support peace, you're a demon, you're a devil. Now, I don't know, maybe I should be offended by this. I think it's kind of hot, I'm not really put off by it, but obviously they don't mean it in the sex-positive sense. They're disgusted by us, and they're trying to grasp at the worst term they can use to describe someone who aspires to peace. And my message for you, and this is the last sentence I'll say tonight, is that the Norwegian people have played an interesting role in the lives of Israelis and Palestinians in the last few years, in the last couple decades. We talked about the Oslo years and the Oslo Accord, and we're standing here in Oslo. And for us, that has meant aspiring towards a two-state solution. But as we can see, as we've talked about for the last hour and a half, it was just a ruse. It was just to pull the wool over your eyes. It was just to lull you back into sleep so you would look away and not pay too much attention, and all the while the Israeli government continued to colonize and makes the two-state solution impossible, so that there never can be Palestinian independence, that there can only ever be apartheid. And what I'm telling you is that perhaps if the Norwegian people want to once again take a moral stand and promote peace in Palestine and Israel, that perhaps you would consider, instead of supporting the two-state solution, instead support the one-state solution. Not the apartheid state solution, but the one democratic state solution. Because I believe that today that is the only peace camp, the only real peace camp in Israel. That's what I want to see. And that's what I hope that you'll join me in calling for. That's it for tonight. Of course.